What was particularly interesting was Dr. Mahathir's claim of the current government's use of enforcement agencies such as the Malaysian Anti-Corruption Commission to harass the opposition. Now, over the past few days, of course, the MACC has taken in for questioning several Bersatu youth, and these youth leaders were said to be aligned to Syed Saddiq. So when Mahathir spoke of this alleged harassment towards Bersatu youth, he had also issued a not-so-veiled threat that if these tactics did not stop, he would expose all of Perikatan Nasional's wrongdoings.
Well, Melissa, I think, the former Prime Minister, twice over as it were, did in fact expose what he thought, and it's part of the kind of narrative he has about the current government. Though I do think that, there were several press conferences today, one by a cabinet minister, with the anticipation, I think, that many people had that he might actually cross over, that he would be yet another person in the current government to announce his resignation. He did, in fact, reiterating again his support for the Prime Minister, Tun Sri Muhyiddin Yassin.
Yeah.
So Mahathir was very different, but I think it's something about the times, don't you think, Melissa?
Hello and good evening. I'm Melissa Idris.
And I'm Sharad Kuttan.
You're watching Consider This, the show where we want you to consider and then reconsider what you know of the news of the day. Now, the biggest news of the day, of course, is the announcement of the short-term economic recovery plan, or what the government calls the PENJANA package. PENJANA package, excuse me. Now, we're going to be delving deeper into the PENJANA package a little later in the show, but I just want to touch on some of the other headlines today. I think dominating headlines today has been particularly interesting, the press conference by Tun Dr. Mahathir Mohamad. What I thought, Sharad, was particularly interesting was Dr. Mahathir's claim of the current government's use of enforcement agencies such as the Malaysian Anti-Corruption Commission to harass the opposition. Now, over the past few days, of course, the MACC has taken in for questioning several Bersatu youth, and these youth leaders were said to be aligned to Syed Saddiq. So when Mahathir spoke of this alleged harassment towards Bersatu youth, he had also issued a not-so-veiled threat that if these tactics did not stop, he would expose all of Perikatan Nasional's wrongdoings.
Well, Melissa, I think, the former Prime Minister, twice over as it were, did in fact expose what he thought, and it's part of the kind of narrative he has about the current government. Though I do think that, there were several press conferences today, one by a cabinet minister, with the anticipation, I think, that many people had that he might actually cross over, that he would be yet another person in the current government to announce his resignation. He did, in fact, reiterating again his support for the Prime Minister, Tun Sri Muhyiddin Yassin.
Yeah.
So Mahathir was very different, but I think it's something about the times, don't you think, Melissa, that, in fact, there is this air of uncertainty. So people are very jumpy.
Yeah,
and so when a press conference is held, they almost immediately assume that something major is going to happen, and that in fact we're going to see a shift in the political dynamics of the country. I think that is also quite interesting, because that's kind of like the story around the story, as it were.
I think the anticipation of the hype around it is really what gets to all of us, right? I mean, earlier today you mentioned all this uncertainty. Earlier today, another minister was speculated to resign. Rizwan Yusof, minister in the Prime Minister's department in charge of special functions. There was this kind of talk or speculation that he could be looking to resign. However, about an hour before to Dr. Mahathir's press conference, the Minister Rizwan had actually said that he was not resigning. So again,
yeah, it's great. It's a great tactic to get a press coverage, even if you don't say very much. But there was substance. Yeah, there's substance to what the former Prime Minister Tun, Dr. Mahathir, said, and of course he fielded all kinds of questions, including the question of whether this was the right time to change government, or you know, and so on and so forth. He even weighed in on the question of who really is responsible for the success of the public health response to the COVID-19 pandemic, and because he lays credit firmly on at the feet of professionals, as he calls them, and also saying and speaking to actually what was rumored several weeks ago, there were attempts to actually remove the Director General of Health. So I mean, it was a very interesting press conference, I think, in that you know, the former Prime Minister gets to air his views.
Well, yeah, I completely agree. But let's turn our attention to other news now. Communications and Multimedia Minister Saifuddin Abdullah has today mooted an anti-hopping law, which he claims could resolve the doubts over the legitimacy of the Perikatan National Government. So he thinks that it's quite interesting that, you know, I particularly think it's quite interesting that he would moot this, because the minister, of course, who is the MP for Indra Mahkota, he himself had quit UMNO to join PKR, and I think that was back in 2015, and earlier this year he had left PKR as well. So this is quite interesting, coming at a time, particularly with this government. The Perikatan National Government is one that's established through party hopping and defections.
Yeah, Melissa, you know, but, you know, so if you put aside the particular, you know, the person who actually sort of making the suggestion and bringing this up at this point in time, I think the question of anti-hopping laws and it's a long-standing conversation, whether that's desirable. And they're, I think, competing principles. They're principles of the right of association versus the other types of principles, and also in recognizing that our current political system gets gamed in particular ways by politicians and political parties to the detriment of the public, it seems. The question of stability, all these, I think, are wrapped up in this very complex constitutional and legal question, but also one that, you know, directly addresses the question of political culture and the changing nature of what Malaysians as citizens and voters want.
I do have to say, though, I mean, you know, I wonder whether this law could ever go through. According to some legal experts, it doesn't. It's not quite in line with the Constitution. I'm looking at comments made by the former Deputy Law Minister Hanifah Maidin last year. It was a parliamentary reply, and you know, in reference to anti-hopping laws, that perhaps it's not quite in line with certain provisions of the Constitution. I'll leave that to the experts. But whether or not it's undemocratic or not is another question.
Penang actually has on its state legislation.
Yes, you're right.
So, in fact, there is an ongoing question now of two Bersatu, you know, aduns whose status is in question because the state has an anti-hopping law. The question is whether the state will be able to push through its demands or claims that these two individuals must vacate their seats.
Right. Okay, we're going to take a little break. After this, we'll take a look at the 35 billion ringgit PENJANA package, which will help the economy, whether or not it will help the economy recover from the pandemic-induced recession. We'll discuss in a few minutes. Stay tuned to consider this. Hello, you're watching Consider This. I'm Melissa Idris, with me, Sharad Kutan. Earlier today, the Prime Minister Tan Sri Muhyiddin Yassin announced an economic recovery plan for the short term, which he called the PENJANA package. Now, will this 35 billion ringgit package, 10 billion of which is direct fiscal injection, will it be enough to help the economy and those struggling the most recover from the economic fallout of the pandemic? Joining us on the line now, we have Nadia Jalil, the CEO of PNB Research Institute. Good evening, Nadia. Thank you so much for joining us tonight. I'd like to start perhaps with your initial reactions to the PENJANA package. Did it live up to your expectations, Nadia?
I think, given the constraints that the government faces in terms of its fiscal space, it pretty much lived up to my expectations in terms of being the best sort of available measures that could be proposed and implemented at this time.
Nadia, do you think? Nadia, do you think that the limitations are self-imposed in that the current government has not gone to Parliament or convened Parliament, getting Parliament's approval for a bigger package? Do you think that this is in fact something that could have been resolved through Parliament?
I think one of the ways in which it could be resolved is if they did go to Parliament and actually move to alleviate some of the legal constraints on the government's fiscal space. So, for instance, in terms of the use of debt funds to fund non-development expenditure. So that's one constraint that possibly could be lifted via legislation. Other measures that could be considered could be in terms of increasing the liquidity in our market. I think there's still some room there, because looking at the fact that, our statutory reserve requirements are still at about 2% and our OPR is quite near zero, I think there's still room to actually provide more liquidity, not just for the financial market as a whole, but to channel some of that liquidity to fund fiscal expenditure.
Nadia, I want to focus a little bit on what the government has called the empowering people pillar. So with the wage subsidy program, just how effective is it in reality? I mean, the Prime Minister in his speech made reference to the success of this program over the past 3 months, saying that it had in fact saved 2.2 million jobs. What's your sense?
I think in a sense, he's not entirely wrong in the sense that it has served 2.2 million employees who may or may not otherwise have been unemployed if their employers had not been able to take advantage of the wage subsidy program. On the other hand, you have to take a look at the fact that the employment retention program was oversubscribed. So in this sense, employers who may not be able to even pay their workers' salaries cannot take advantage, cannot put their employees on unpaid leave, because if you do that, you're not qualified for the wage subsidy program. So perhaps there is a way of adjusting these between the wage subsidy and the employment retention program to put more emphasis on employment retention, given the fact that we've got about 10 million people employed by small and medium enterprises in this country, and they are the most vulnerable when it comes to the impact of COVID-19, as well as in terms of income level.
Nadia, can I ask you about the fact that in some countries, either income, substitution or support has been given for very long periods, from 9 to 12 months, that's been laid out by governments. Here we see a much shorter term response. Why do you think that is?
If you're talking about a country like Singapore, for instance, it's a function of the fact that they've got a lot more room in terms of the fiscal space. So currently, they're funding about 20% of their COVID-19 measures in terms of fiscal injections, 20% in terms of GDP, right? Comparatively for Malaysia, around our direct fiscal injections comprise about 3% of GDP. So part of that is the fact that we do have these fiscal constraints, and it's not simply in terms of going to the government to lift some of these measures. The fact of the matter is, even before COVID-19 appeared on our shores, our economy was challenged by the fact that, we had the oil price crash, and that clearly puts a damper on the government's revenue streams.
Okay. Well,
so you've got to think about all that.
Right. Nadia, just coming back to something you said a little bit earlier about whether this actually is enough for the most vulnerable, for the groups, the most vulnerable in Malaysia. I'm wondering about those who have already lost their jobs. Are the initiatives that have been announced today enough to address the jobs already lost?
Well, technically, if you've already lost your job, then you're not liable for the wage subsidy package, right? So you can only take recourse to unemployment insurance, as well as the various VPN packages that are available. So there's some one-off measures that were announced today that may help to alleviate some of the pain. But at some point, I think there could be room to actually widen our social safety net in the future and look at deepening these measures.
Right. And what do you think are some of the trade-offs, that the government had to consider when coming up with this package? I'm sure you talked a little bit about the constraints that the government has, but what do you think they had to trade off when coming up with the PENJANA package?
Well, I think we've kind of talked. I think the main trade-off is really in terms of the financing of how much the government can actually finance. So when you think about how an economy can grow, it's either via household activity or private firm activity or government injection. Essentially what happens in the pandemic is, even without a mass lockdown, in order to flatten the curve, as it were, what you need is actually a suppression of production and consumption. So it's slightly different from like a recession-based economy where you have to stimulate demand. In this case, what's going to happen is that the economy is being put on suspended animation, right? So the room for stimulating private investment, for instance, is not going to be there until we actually see perhaps the appearance of widely available vaccines. So that's probably one of the trade-offs that the government had to consider, in the sense that the room for more in-depth and wider stimulus packages is not quite there yet in terms of incentives. The other is obviously in terms of public health. So if you want to actually stimulate an economy, consumption would have to be there, but then you risk a reversal of the flattening curve. So you'd have to take that into account. Right. So I think this is one of the reasons behind the fact that they finally expanded the wage subsidy to cover for sectors that have been directly impacted or cannot operate during the MCO and CMCO, such as tourism.
Yes.
That's essentially an employment retention program rather than a wage subsidy, right? The final one is as Shara touched upon just now, is in terms of these legislative constraints. So these are, I think, the set of constraints that the government had to work with in order to formulate the package.
Okay. Well, Nadia, thank you so much for speaking with us tonight. We really appreciate your time as well as your insights. Now we're going to take a quick break and more on the PENJANA package in just a few minutes. Stay tuned to consider this. Thank you so much for staying with Sharad and I on Consider This. Let's continue our conversation about the PENJANA package, which was announced this afternoon. Joining us on the line now, we have Zheng, Research Manager at the think tank Institute for Democracy and Economic Affairs, or better known as Ideas. Lau, good evening. Thank you so much for joining us. I'd like to begin with a focus on the portion of the package which the government claims to have earmarked for stimulating the economy through sectoral support. Now, what are your thoughts on the sectors that have received government support? Do you think the package hit all the right targets there?
Hi, good evening. I think overall the key initiatives presented earlier today is quite broad-based. But you know, as a researcher, I tend to ask questions which are more long-term, and I tend to ask questions about the structure. Now, you mentioned about sectors there, and the big portion of it has been allocated to address the worst hit sector. This entails the airline, this entails the accommodation and tourism. But I just want to ask certain long-term questions here, because there's a change, I guess, in the consumer behavior. The people could just reduce air travel, and whether or not this allocation will stimulate demand, or should the government be considering a different approach since the consumer behavior has changed.
Okay, that's quite interesting. I want to ask you about whether, so you think that the right sectors have been supported, and I'm wondering about the imbalance in perhaps some of the sectoral support. Some economists have pointed to the fact that the property sector got 1 billion ringgit. I mean, tourism, yes, hard hit, 1.8 billion, but what about manufacturing? Manufacturing could generate a lot more jobs. It only got about 50 million ringgit.
Well, I mean, it's interesting that we're comparing the worst hit sectors like airline and tourism you mentioned there, and also manufacturing, because as we know, manufacturing depends a lot on the global demand, which is not great at the moment. So it's quite hard, even if, you know, through the various wage subsidy program and, you know, financial assistance, to try to incentivize factories, businesses to hire people, but you know the demand for the factory orders is not there. So it's quite interesting. You know, if the government were to allocate more money, does it really increase you know, demand for labor and also output?
Okay.
Lau, do you think this is the time for government to get involved in a discussion about pivoting the economy in a different direction, using this crisis, or in fact issues around things like the China-America trade war, to kind of rethink the economy as a whole? I mean, is this the right time to do that?
Yeah, I mean, this is the most important time to be talking about all these things. Look, I think we have managed to at least address the COVID pandemic. I think we've done much better than our neighboring countries. So we are actually in a good position, I think, to be benefiting from some of these reconfiguration of supply chain that as a result of US-China trade war, and also the fact that multinationals came to realize that you have to diversify away from depending only on the Chinese supply chain ecosystem. So which is why I think the government has mentioned incentives to attract FDIs, and hoping to catch some of this benefits of reconfiguration. But then at the same time, I think you already mentioned, is there an opportunity for the government to be introducing some changes to the structure of the economy? I think I will start probably with the promotion of the digital adaptation. I think it's good that the government tries to include a broad spectrum of the digital economy, although the focus is still on increasing e-commerce participation for now.
Right.
But then, you know, there is I guess, a lot more long-term investment could be considered at this point to ramp up on AI. And if you look at what China is doing now, they're building AI innovation trial zones across the country, just to test out how application of AI can be done.
Lau, I'm so glad, Lau, that you brought up the focus on digital, because I do wonder whether, you know, these multiple initiatives that the government has introduced to encourage businesses to shift online, whether you see gaps in this. You know, will there be people not captured by this effort?
Well, I mean, certain businesses will catch up faster than the other. I think entrepreneurial skills and abilities matter. The structure of the businesses in question matters. If you are in the service-oriented business, it's actually quite hard for you to be pivoting fully to digital adaptation. And for factories, you mentioned manufacturing earlier just now, there are also grants on automation. But then the question really is, do you want to take the risk of investing on making capital investment now when you're not very sure if you're going to get enough factory orders, to justify that sort of investment? So it's quite hard for a lot of businesses to be thinking about full pivot to e-commerce and also automation and the other digital adaptation.
A lot of people are focused, or at least commentators are focused on the B40, concerned about their fate, not having much savings and so on and so forth. But what about the M40? Do you think the middle class, already characterized as in a kind of a squeeze all these decades, do you think they're going to be squeezed even more? And has there been any relief for them?
Well, M40 is a huge spectrum there. You can imagine maybe the lower quintiles of the M40, they may end up in B40. Imagine a household with two parents working and one of them lost a job or both of them lose a job. They could end up falling into the B40 category. But if you look at the existing programs here, let's just start with wage subsidy, for example. There's an extension of 5 billion to this program. But if you look at what happened in Prihatin, of the total 13.8 billion that was allocated in Prihatin, only 3.22 billion was actually approved as of 31st of May 2020. So, the question really arises whether or not the efficiency of disbursement and giving approvals are there, because it matters. I think the speed of getting all these things approved, so that the lower quintiles of the M40 will not slip into the B40.
Okay.
As for the other spectrum of the M40 households, I think businesses are getting incentives to defray the cost, business costs, but whether or not that will be translated into employee retention or support, that is quite hard to tell. I think it depends on businesses.
Right.
But at the end of the day, I think looking at this crisis, we're talking about embracing new normal here. There will be changes to consumer behavior, and the future need for different types of skills will be there. So certain jobs that are lost today.
I want to touch on something. So you said you talked a little bit about the wage subsidy. I want to talk a bit about income replacement and job retention. Has that been sufficiently covered in the PENJANA package?
It's quite hard to gauge actually, because certain jobs could lose because of the changing nature of business. Really, it feels like at this point of time, some of these measures are still more geared towards protection based. Just try to prolong the protection, prolong the income replacement. But the hard question of whether or not enough incentives are given to upskill and for businesses to transform, and whether or not people who lose their jobs or who are about to lose their job will be able to adapt to new skills, whether or not skill substitutability is perfect. So I think the government can try and introduce these income replacement measures, but the demand for some of these skills, the changes in some of these occupations could be a big issue.
Well, thank you so much for speaking with us tonight, Lau. We appreciate your time and for you sharing your reaction to the PENJANA package. And it was just recently announced, but we've all had some time to digest it now. I'm sure we'll come out with more. We'll see a lot more analysis over the weekend as well. Thank you, Lau, for your time. And that's all the time we have for you on this episode of Consider This. I'm Melissa Idris.
And I'm Sure Couldn't, signing off for this evening.
Thank you so much for watching. Have a great weekend, folks. Good night.